afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this public lecture and discussion about culture, food, and climate. What we eat and how we produce our food plays a big role for our climate on Earth. We may need to change a lot of what we have taken for granted about food. But food is not just any product. It's something very special for us. We eat different things in different parts of the world. Food is a big part of our culture. Changing our eating habits may not be such an easy thing to do, or is it? Those are some of the things we will be talking about today. Today's discussion is one in a series of public lectures called Tour d'Europe, provided by CIVICA, the European University of Social Sciences. CIVICA is a collaboration between 8 leading European higher education institutions in the social sciences, humanities, business, economics, and public policy. It is funded by the European Union. I should mention that today's presentation will be recorded and it will also be available on the CIVICA website afterwards. My name is Göran Lindqvist and I will be the moderator. I am Director of Research at the Stockholm School of Economics in Sweden, standing in for Laurence Romani, who unfortunately could not be here today. It will soon be my pleasure to introduce to you 3 exciting experts on culture, food, and climate, namely Valentina Bosetti at the Bocconi University in Milan, Italy, Hannes Leo at the Polislab European Future Innovation System Center in Brussels, Belgium, and Friederike Döbbe here at the Stockholm School of Economics in Sweden. We will first hear a presentation by each of our 3 experts, and after each presentation there will be time for a few questions. And then we will move on to a roundtable discussion with a whole panel. And again, there will be opportunity for a few questions to the panel. If you want to ask a question, please write it in the chat, and my colleagues, Simona and Yuchen, will collect your questions and pass them on to me. So, without further ado, let's get started. And our first presenter is Valentina Bosetti. She is Professor of Environmental and Climate Change Economics at Bocconi University, where she teaches a course in Climate Change Economics. She is also a senior scientist at the European Institute on Economics and the Environment. But rather than listening to me reading her CV, which I can tell you is quite extensive, I think you want to hear her presentation instead. So, Valentina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Göran, and thank you for all of you who are attending this seminar. So I'll use a few slides, and I promise I'll be brief. I want to tell you why we started to ask ourselves the question about food. We started from the viewpoint of climate change. I work mostly on modeling, and I run these scenarios that basically answer the question: if you want to stabilize the temperature below a certain temperature level by the end of the century, what should we be doing? And one of the big elements that drives the cost of the transition is typically how much demand for energy do we have, how much demand for land, etc. So we have started to investigate demand side mitigation options, and one of these demand side is changing food behavior, because we know that for example, the amount of animals or livestock really does influence the amount of emissions that we produce. Now, the key point is that when we run scenarios that say, look at everybody becomes vegetarian, these scenarios can form an envelope or the maximum potential of this key mitigation, demand side mitigation option, but do not really tell us what we can actually get. And so starting from there, from these extreme scenarios, we ask ourselves, what is really feasible? How much change can we get? And to answer the question, one important element is what has driven change in the past, what drives decisions of what to eat, how much is culture, and how much this can change. So the idea was to bridge evidence from empirical analysis and other disciplinary knowledge coming, for example, from anthropology, and bring that knowledge to modeling and scenario analysis as the one done in the IPCC. So we started off taking a look at what data we can actually have, at what level, what granularity, and it's very hard because some of these data are at the minimum scale you have is the country scale. How much, for example, cows are consumed in every country. You cannot really have this information at a lower scale. So that basically was constraining the type of approach we decided to take. And the idea was to build a model, a very simple and stylized model that would define the final meat consumption choice as a function of the traditional economic drivers, so how much money you have and how much, for example, meat costs, and then a set of other elements that made define your preferences, and this range from religious norms to the level of urbanization, gender equality, and education. Now, it's important to note, I come from an economic background, that there's very little literature on, that economics has contributed on diets and food choices. And so we've looked into that, but then we had to look into many other disciplines which have looked more at this issue. The only branch of economics is that of economic history that has looked a lot into these questions. So once we collected the data and we sort of built a model in our head that is as simple as the one you just seen, we decided to analyze the data with, on the one hand, the models that were based on theory, with predictors that would come from the theory that we had in mind, would be very simple, and then to confirm these models with sort of machine learning models, where basically everything goes, just tell me the data, just tell me what would be the best predictor of livestock demand. At that point, once we had a model, we project the model forward. So we have projection forward for some of the key drivers. And then we compare this with what comes out from the traditional models that are used, for example, in the IPCC. So how is the projection that is based on, this historically based regression compared to how does it compare with the ones done by modelers who really, build their model to answer the question about mitigations, not really, they didn't really have in mind the idea of diets and dietary changes. So this is just a glimpse of the results, just to give you a sense of what are the key predictors of dietary changes or changes in the consumption of various types of meats, because we run the model for, different types of meat. And most of these drivers are, won't surprise you. GDP per capita is one, for example. The share of urban population is the second, whilst there is an opposite effect of the growth in urban population. And then again, a negative effect on the increase in the consumption for meat, depending on secondary education and the gap in gender education. So what we did then is this is just to give you a glimpse of what we are now doing with these models. We have, as you see here in black, the history of the consumption. For example, in this case is country level per meat type, and it is beef and Italy. We have the history. We have the FAO prediction that is moving forward from 2010. And then we have the different predictions that we can do with different types of models. So with all predictors, for example, this would be the predicted all, or just GDP, which is what typically models have done so far. They just insert and included GDP per capita as the main drivers of meat consumption. And we can do this for different countries and for different type of proteins. Why are we doing this? Because that allows us then to compare our projection, not only with FAO projections, but with the simplest projections done by a model, and ask ourselves the questions, was it worth to go through the pain of estimating a complex model, given that to project forward, we will have to have information about additional variables. Is it worthy? Do we get very different results or not? And this is all for me. And I hope, this gave you an idea of what we're doing, and I will be happy to, answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Valentina. So if you have any questions for Valentina, put them in the chat. So if I can open up a bit here. So your model is based on historical data about consumption of different types of livestock. So if we look at the period of urbanization in Europe, it had direct economic consequences. People had more money to spend on food, but it also had indirect consequences. So lifestyles changed, the need for calorie intake changed, the type of households changed, and the way kitchens were built, etc. All those things changed, which of course had some effect, I guess, on food. And I guess that was a process that took some time in Europe to happen during the big wave of urbanization. Is it possible that historical trends were slower than today's development? Is it possible that today we change our habits quicker for technological or social reasons or something like that?
I guess that's indeed the case. So we have models. I mean, the data we have constrains us to study history starting from 1960, because it's then from there only that we start to have information for all countries on the planet, almost all. So I'm sure that from the 60s onwards, the changes were moving much faster than they did in the past. One element that we are exploring now is the demographic composition of countries. The number of people under the age of 25. In the first analysis, we just running these regressions in the last few days. The number of people younger than 25, the share of people younger than 25 really drives how fast change can happen. But it's unclear in which direction. It really depends on the region. It has been a clear, important driver of change towards less consumption of meat in Europe. It's been a driver of change towards greater consumption in Latin America and Asia. So it's a very complex compound effect of the demographic composition, how much money the inequality level, which we don't have here because it's very hard to get, dating back from the 60s. We're working on that, but in the inequality, so who has the money matters, of course, and the price, so the availability of the goods. So prices of meat have been going down because of technical change that has happened very fast. Right. So it's a very complex phenomenon. What we intend to do is not to have a clear definition of what, what's moving what, but to get a sense of whether we can predict the future consumption a little better than simply saying it's a function of GDP per capita, so GDP per capita. Because if you do that, then you would have massive, you see some papers on PNS saying, okay, if China keeps growing like this, then we won't know where to grow those cows. But it's not inevitably the case that, becoming richer, we will all start to eat more meat. There have been, other factors.
Exactly, GDP is not everything. And perhaps migration is another factor. Increased migration is perhaps something that increases the speed with which we change our eating habits. Could that be the case?
we didn't check it. We didn't check for this, but we certainly could. I mean, we know the numbers are very small at the moment. So the number of people, although they are very big in the media, they are actually very small amount of people. And so, but maybe to drive a change, but it's something we should be looking into.
Yeah. And then we have, again, of course, something you haven't studied, but perhaps you can speculate. Technical developments such as synthetic meats, cultured meats. Could that be a game changer?
So that is something that colleagues are studying. For example, Nicolas Treisch is at Toulouse University. He's studying what? He's studying the perception of people towards, at the moment, most of the research I've seen on this type of meat, besides the engineeristic, the research to actually produce this meat, has been marketing research, kind of to try to understand what is the willingness to pay or to accept to consume this kind of meat. And apparently there are very high level of disgust at the moment, still associated with this synthetically produced meat. A different story goes for the plant-based sort of fake meat that has gained the taste of the general public. Although there are recent studies showing that is, not everything that is, that is sparks is gold. There are problems associated with the production in terms of emissions and in terms of health with the production of these very much processed goods. But in terms of methane emissions, which is what worries the most people about red meat, I think these are safer products and more accepted by the consumers.
And we will get back to consumers later on in today's seminar. But thank you very much, Valentina. So now let's change the perspective a bit. And from the macro perspective, we will now look at what kind of decisions one can take to change food consumption. Our next presenter is Dr. Hannes Leo, who is co-founder and CEO of the innovation consultancy firm CIVICA in Vienna, Austria. And he has been doing a lot of work on food systems in Vienna. And that is something I believe we will hear more about now. We look forward to your presentation, Hannes.
Yes, thank you very much, Göran. I already listened with much interest to Valentina's presentation, because studies like her were really important for the work we are doing at the city level. And I try to share my screen now. What I'm presenting is basically a study we are still in the process of doing for the city of Vienna. We are going to present the results at the end of June. And basically, this is done by the Austrian Institute of Economic Research and the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. We got two basically simple questions from the city of Vienna. The first one was, how big is the food sector in Vienna? This might sound trivial for you, but actually to know how big it is from agriculture to each and every restaurant in Vienna is not so trivial. You need a lot of databases and you have to merge them to get results. And the second question was, are there any recommendations for innovation policies in that field that the city could do? So in what I'm presenting is not so much on the city of Vienna, but what cities can do in the process of maybe changing diets and what we have learned in this study over time. Basically, you have traditionally, I would say, two policies that impact on the food sector. One is agricultural policy that is interested in food security and safety, and also the income of farmers. That has worked quite well. If we take the pandemic as stress test, we didn't have any major shortages in that period. And the second one are policies to increase competitiveness. Innovation is one of the issues there. That's basically an approach to increase economic growth, exports, employment, or whatsoever. Yeah? The problem with these policies is that they more or less ignore the side effects of the food sector. We have heard already some of these. You may know that 1/3 of greenhouse gases due to the food sector. Half of or more of half of these emissions are due to animal products. That's why it's so important to model the impact of meat and other animal products on climate change and to know what is driving consumption. But also the health sector is very important in this respect, and unhealthy diets really have an impact on morbidity and mortality, meaning that the impact of unhealthy diets is bigger than unprotected sex, alcohol, tobacco, and drug abuse altogether. So if you not only change climate emissions, but also improve health of the population, that's already two things that you can impact with the diets or with changing the food system. Of course, water consumption is high, pollution is high, and also biodiversity loss caused by agriculture is another serious problem. So our assessment was basically that without addressing the food system and what we are eating, it's impossible to save the climate problem, the climate crisis. You have to do something in this respect as well. The emissions are simply too big. And there are other forecasts, I don't know if Valentina agrees, that say that the emissions due to food out of the food sector are going to increase by another 50% up to 2050. That is related to people in Asia or South America or Africa changing their diets and adopting more Western-style diets. That includes more meats and animal products. So researchers have asked what are really the levers to change emissions out of the food sector. And at least one very prominent study that was published recently, the Lancet study, said that 80% of the potential to reduce emissions out of the food sector are going to be realized by reducing the intake of animal products. 10% you can realize if you change the production, how food is produced, or the way how food is produced, and 5% by reducing food waste. So there are also diets around, again, it's the Eat Lancet diet that I will put into the spotlight, that already came up with suggestions how or what kind of diets would be suitable to provide sustainable and healthy food for a growing population. Yeah, so this is there. You don't have to go fully vegan, but it's not that far away from that. Yeah, that's at least what they recommend at the moment. Yeah. I think one interesting side effect of this suggestion is, and that is something not so many people realize, that almost 80% of agricultural land is used to produce feed for the animals. Yeah, so if you reduce the intake of animal products, you release a lot of agricultural land that you can use as carbon sink, basically. Yeah? One study recently that was published in Nature suggested that if the wealthy countries follow the Eat Lancet diet, we would have land of the size of Europe available to use as a carbon sink. If you plant trees there, if you renature that, this would have a huge impact on absorbing CO2, and of course a huge impact on climate change overall. So that would make more ambitious targets again likely. That was, I think, at the moment it's not very. Many things are not really going in the right direction. Anyway, so the question was, what can cities do in this respect? Yeah? What you see here is the ecosystem for the Viennese food system. Of course, you can't read it, I know. So each of these panels is an actor in the food ecosystem in Vienna, and this goes across the different governance layers. So you have the European level, the national level, the city or regional level. The interesting thing, I think, is that the European part is rather small. Yeah, it's there, it's important, but at the city level, which is blue, and on the right-hand side of this chart, you see all the different departments Vienna has that actually impact on the food sector or whose performance is impacted by the food sector. That includes climate policies, health policies, agriculture, and economic policies. So you have to broaden the perspective. I think that is one of the conclusions we saw at the level of policymakers. That's not only the case for the city level, but of course for the European or national level as well. You have to integrate these policy fields to achieve something if you want to impact on the food sector. That means also that you have to include the food sector in climate mitigation strategies, which is often not the case at the moment. This is due to how greenhouse gases are being accounted at the moment, but that is maybe something we can discuss later on. And of course, you have to be able to coordinate across these departments and to implement and execute complex strategy to really have an impact. Innovation, and that brings me back to the original question, is an important ingredient in this strategy in two ways. The first way is that the city as such has to innovate. That is not easy for a public sector institution, which is usually rather risk averse, not used to change the ways they are doing. They have a huge potential in institutions they can directly control. In many citizens, they have some influence on whatever food is offered in schools, hospitals, retirement homes, canteens, and so on. So this can be rather big. Of course, it's not always the same in each and every city, but in many cities, there is some things they can change in this respect. Before they are able to do this, they have to have the appropriate dietary guidelines, which they don't have at the moment, that also take into account the impact on climate. So the Eat Lancet diet would be a starting point for that as well. And once you have that in place, you can then change what you're offering, you can change your procurement policies and so on. The second part, and that was already touched upon, is you can foster or encourage research and innovation on alternatives for animal products. A lot of things are happening here, but we are still at the beginning of it. You basically would like to come up with products that offer the same experience as meat, but don't need you to change your eating behavior. That is one of the advantages, and this can either be plant-based, fermentation-based, or cell-based. A lot of investment is already going on, but I think this is really at the bottom of the diffusion curve at the moment. Yeah. And the last issue, but not the least one, is you have to actually start to have a dialogue with citizens about the food system, its impact, what is needed to change, what each and everyone can do. And that, of course, should be based on research, of which I think we will hear more later. So that's it from my side. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Hannes. So first, a simple question. I saw you had a number, 5% we can save by reducing food waste. Is it not more? I seem to have heard that a lot more food is wasted, but maybe it's only 5%.
Of course, there's a lot of food wasted across the value chain, and of course, on the side of the final consumer as well. But the climate impact might be a different one. Yeah, if the food waste is vegetables or fruit, it's not that big. As far as I know, numbers that I've heard for Austria, 2% of the food waste is meat. Yeah, so this has still a more than proportional impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but it's a small part. Yeah, so actually, it's rather because the impact of meat and animal product is so much higher than of vegetables, you have a far bigger impact if you change what you what food you eat.
So working with innovation and change on the regional level, on the city region level, is not an easy thing. In your experience, how have your recommendations been received?
I mean, we didn't have the final presentation yet, but at the moment, as far as I would say, they are quite pleased with what they hear, but still they know that this is a big task for them to implement it. And you have to have politicians to really buy that strategy as well. I don't know if they are going to do it, but if they do, then you still have to work across the administration, and you have to change things at many levels. And be innovative, encourage people to come up with new solutions, involve the final consumers, the people that actually should eat what they are being offered in this innovation process as well. So this is actually a lot of work, and there have been attempts that totally failed in changing the diets. In Denmark, you had a case for that where they wanted to change or I think they wanted to have 2 veggie days per week in canteens, and then they had trade unions coming up and saying that's not possible at all. Yeah, so you actually have in this case also to work with people, not just implement. Yeah, without listening to the consumers, not taking their views on the issue, and of course you have to communicate and explain why you would like to change diet.
So many city regions have been working with networks, industry networks, innovation systems, clusters, tools like that on an industry-specific level. And here we are partly talking about changing the whole value chain in the food sector. So could existing innovation networks, say agricultural clusters, organizations like that, could they be useful in promoting this kind of change that you are talking about?
Yeah, I think they can be useful. And a lot of change is already happening in traditional innovation systems, and incumbents are already changing. They are building vegan product lines and what's all acquiring vegan companies. So a lot of these changes are being done. And innovation might not be the easiest way to do it. Yeah, I think it would be preferable if you change consumer attitudes first, because changing your eating habits, that is basically something you could theoretically do tomorrow. Yeah, you could become a vegan tomorrow. Yeah? There you can change really a lot of things. If you go through innovation and want to come up with substitutes for animal product, that takes time. They all have a diffusion curve. We don't know how fast this is going to be. That's actually something we do in another project. But it takes time. But changing habits, I mean, it takes time too, yeah, but actually it could happen fast.
So thank you very much, Hannes. You mentioned consumers, and that brings us naturally to our next presentation, the topic of responsibility of firms and consumers. So Friederike or Fritzi, Fritzi is a doctoral candidate here at Stockholm School of Economics, and she is active at the Department of Management and Organization and at the Mistra Center for Sustainable Markets.
Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Can you hear me? Yes, absolutely. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, I'm going to talk a bit about a few things that I'm working on in my PhD project. And let's jump right into this. So we've heard from our previous speakers that climate change is a massive issue, and the role of agriculture and food systems therein, and that basically agriculture, land use and forestry together contribute to a large chunk of emissions, about a third actually of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And yet, so we've had this knowledge, we know about climate change and the role of food therein for quite a while, for several decades actually, but still we see greenhouse gas emissions rising and overshooting our planetary boundaries. And in my PhD, I'm looking at one kind of element around, well, basically, why do we still have kind of these business as usual scenarios? And prior research has lined out some of the reasons, therefore, around climate skepticism and also discourses of delay that are kind of permeating society. And one element thereof that I'm particularly interested in is really the question of responsibility, and how is responsibility distributed amongst different societal actors, and kind of redirecting responsibility as a form of climate delay. So previous research there has looked, for example, into the interactions between businesses and states, so kind of corporations filling in governance gaps where the state might have not been so active, but also to this idea around shifting responsibility onto the consumer and consumer choice. And my starting point here really is to understand these responsibility distributions and discourses around this as embedded in a wider political-economic context, and also in kind of power dynamics and power relations. And I want to give you two examples from my ongoing research, where one relates to kind of consumer responsibilization and how that is actually taken up by consumers. And the second one relates to kind of policy frames more at the macro level and how they are shaped by political actors. So the first example is a project that I've been working on with my colleague Emilia Cederberg here from SSE. And we studied a marketing campaign by a Swedish chicken producer, so poultry producer. And that campaign that received quite some headwinds within Sweden. And essentially what they were saying, what this chicken producer was saying in that campaign is that you consumers, you can do something simple for the climate by switching from eating beef to eating chicken. And we've heard that from also our previous talks that, I mean, meat consumption is a key issue when it gets to food. And we know that chicken has a lower greenhouse gas emission potential than beef. So in this campaign, what happens is that this corporation compares then the food consumption to airline travel, and basically gives the idea that you save a whole lot of emission that is equivalent to about 50 flights with jumbo jets if you make that shift. So that campaign was taken up critically, and my colleague and I, we study complaints to the Swedish Consumer Agency and also on social media, because we wanted to understand, okay, what actually happened here? What did consumers think about this suggested shift? And specifically, we interpret this campaign as a form of consumer responsibilization and then try to understand, okay, why is this resisted? Why is this contested? Without going into the theoretical details of the study, is that we found consumers in general, they accept the idea of taking personal responsibility, so individual responsibility for their food choices. But what they question are kind of the margins of what it means to consume responsibly in the climate context. And generally we see that there is quite a broad knowledge amongst consumers about the role of climate change in food, but it's really the margins of responsible consumption that are negotiated. So for example, the consumer comments that we studied, they show that consumers question what is really kind of integrated into this emission calculation that this chicken producer made. For example, do they consider what the feed of the chicken was? For example, did they eat soy, and for what land use kind of deforestation took place? Or what about the transportation of these poultry products? Are these emissions that are integrated into the calculations? So they kind of start to question the underlying knowledge that goes into that marketing campaign. Others, for example, suggest, well, we should also watch out for animal welfare. You're not talking about this, or they're asking to go vegan instead of making that shift to only eating chicken. So there's a whole range really of reactions, actually some also pointing out to kind of the role of Swedish agriculture and that this campaign would pitch different farmers against each other. So chicken farmers against beef farmers. And what this really shows is that the question of what kind of food to consume is one that people are concerned about, but that they also kind of struggle over. And that they contest on kind of different on different levels, but not really in the way of a hard form of resistance, but rather in like counter-conducting and like asking to be governed in that sense from a power perspective slightly differently. And then the second example that I want to present to you is one from a more recent project with a colleague from Australia called Daniel Nyberg, an organization scholar. And in that study, that's much more macro. So I'm taking you away from the consumer to kind of how are sustainable diets discussed on a macro level in the international realm, so and on the kind of level of international global governance. And in this study, we studied how the policy frame sustainable diets, how that is shaped within the UN context. So what we did was we traced this concept. We knew that there were contestations from different UN member countries around this concept, and we traced how this frame developed within the UN, so within the World Food Organization, World Food and Agriculture Organization, sorry, the World Health Organization, and the Committee on World Food Security. So this is also a qualitative study, and we conducted a frame analysis. And what we show in this paper is, and that is still work in progress, but what we're showing is how this policy frame sustainable diets shifted over time to sustainable healthy diets, and more recently to healthy diets through sustainable food systems. And underlying this change really was quite, so this notion, sustainable diets, it was quite contested within the realm of the UN, with certain member countries really being in favor of it, amongst others the EU, but others less so, or rather they didn't want to talk about it, and that's specifically countries from Latin America and also the United States of America. And so we explain this frame shift through a framing perspective and come up with different frame disbandment processes that we identified. So these are the processes in a way through which this initial frame sustainable diets got demobilized or kind of undone strategically in the international level. Yeah, and as I said, the kind of this was quite a political debate, and what we learned from talking to people within the UN is that the role of livestock was one of the key reasons for why this contestation came about. So the role of agriculture in general, but then livestock and meat and dairy consumption in particular, because countries question, what does it mean if we talk about the environmental sustainability of diets on the international level? What effects will that have on kind of policies? And that could be national policies, but also countries might be affected through trade. And these kind of key policy frames, they also inform on the national level policies such as food-based dietary guidelines, which Hannes mentioned earlier. Yeah, so just to kind of wrap up, what I'm interested in really in my PhD is then what role does responsibility and responsibility distribution play when we talk about sustainable diets and sustainable food systems? What struggles emerge over this? If responsibility is attributed to the consumers, how do they take that up? And then on the international level, how is sustainability of food framed there? Is it something to be solved on the individual level of diets, or is it solved at the food systems level? And as I said, recently there has been more of a shift towards the systems perspective. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Fritzi. So in this study of the poultry campaign, so you studied the reactions and the discourse around the campaign and how consumers reacted to it. Mm-hmm. Do you know if it also had an impact on the actual consumption of poultry?
No, we didn't. That is something that we didn't look into, but it would of course be interesting to find out. Yeah, mm-hmm. But that is something we didn't study. No.
Okay, Valentina, you had a comment, please.
Wait, when you raise your hand, then there's two things that you have to do. Also unmute yourself. So I have a question. I find fascinating the shift from the language or narrative of sustainable diets towards a more sort of egocentric or human-centric healthy diets, no? And so I wonder whether you find, or if you did look for a correlation with this biocentrism versus anthropocentrism can be measured or has been measured in other way at the macro scale through countries. And I wonder whether the blocks of countries that supported the shift towards this health narrative are also countries that tend to be more towards or in favor of an anthropocentric point of view in the approach to the environment in general and policymaker in general. So if there is a correlation, I think it would be fascinating to see that. And then the fact that it derailed the whole discourse will probably depend on how large these countries are and whether the US is with them, etc. But it would be intriguing. Never thought about that there could be this correlation that we've seen so many times with other issues.
Yeah, fascinating aspect that you're raising. I've also not thought about this before, but I'd be curious to hear more from you actually after this about the kind of about that kind of data. I mean, in our study, we didn't study this aspect in particular. So what we really found were these concerns about what does it mean from an environmental sustainability perspective if diets have to change, and that was something that was contested and that member countries struggled over. And then I wonder kind of whether health, then like talking about healthy diets was like the next best kind of, or the common denominator that was found in order to kind of find some consensus. But I think this is a really interesting question, the dynamics between biocentrism and anthropocentrism. Love to see research on that, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So those were the three presentations, and they all cover food and culture and how this affects our climate. So open up a bit. If we start with culture, so these three presentations, all of them touched on food and climate, but also on culture in one way or another. So how did you see, what kind of, how do you see that cultural aspects play a role in your study? Hannes, were there cultural aspects central in your study? Did you see cultural aspects playing in how different cities react to different suggestions to policy changes?
I have to say, as an economist, I don't really feel at ease to talk about culture. It's quite difficult from my point of view. What I encounter in my discussion is using culture as a rather defensive argument for the way we are eating at the moment, for what we are doing right now. This is part of our culture. It has always been that way, which of course is not true because the diets are changing all the time, but it's used in that way. So this is so, whatever eating habit is so strongly related to a region, to a person, to whatever, that it can't be changed. I encounter culture in that respect quite often. And of course it's, I don't know what culture, I mean, it's difficult. It's food is often related to places which are renowned for it or popular for it. So part of the culture there maybe. But actually, I think I can't really contribute to that discussion.
I think it's different how different industries are perceived in different regions. The same industry can in one region be perceived as something really old-fashioned, there is nothing going on there, let's not waste any innovation money on them because it's an old industry. And the same industry, the same sector can in another region be considered, this is high-tech, this is exciting stuff, this is where we need to put our money.
Yes, I think that is actually something you can see in the food sector right now, because a lot of the traditional food processing regions or sectors, they are really investing in innovation and marketing to come up with new products, to market them in a much more up-to-date way, to really come up with startups. You see regions that have food strategies now, but they are most of the time in line with the traditional innovation argument, growth argument, more exports, more employment, more growth, and they more or less ignore the impact on climate change or pay lip service only to these aspects. Whereas we think that you really should turn this around and actively take this impact into your calculations and come up with strategies that are really more sustainable, not just for the environment, but also for people.
Valentina, of course, culture was central to your study.
Yes, I
Sorry.
find fascinating that the fact that in different countries the role of gender is so different in the consumption of meat. So there is some countries where basically this is, I mean, anthropologically it makes sense. It was the prize for the strongest hunter. So it was something that would the alpha male would get in the largest amount, and you still see among younger generation male the idea that to grow muscle, to grow bigger, you need a lot of meat. So and this is very hard, I think, to debunk, also because, and this is, I think, crucial, food science, actually nutrition science, is not a science, because the biggest universities in the US, where you have typically the best research, the food department is funded by the food industry. And so it's very hard to wrap your head around food nutrition science, because all of a sudden you discover that that study that proved that blueberries are the best for your brain is funded by the Blueberry Corporation in Canada, etc. So it's a very complex world where the last word on what is actually good to grow muscle or not, for health or not, is confused. And it's not really clear cut, because it's very hard to do a study. I mean, there is the famous, unfamous China's whatever, the China study, or the big book where they collected a lot of data, but it's very hard to pinpoint the causality mechanism behind eating certain food and something happening to you. So that complicates the role of science in changing what we think are behaviors, because it's not that clear cut. One last thing I wanted to say is that we are hoping to run an experiment, and what we discover is that a very recent meta-analysis on the role of experiments on changing behavior, various behavior, pro-social behavior, energy consumption behavior, etc., found the greatest effect. This was really a meta-analysis of a lot of studies on food behavior. Basically, the behavior you can change the most, for example, with information studies or with the studies explaining what the norm is, etc., is food behavior. So we know there is much more plasticity, as Anders was saying, that we actually think normally there is, because we think it's culturally based, but actually we can move a lot. There is a lot of wiggle room and a lot of space to change that behavior, much more than we think.
So you had a strong effect for gender difference in education in your study. Do I remember that correctly? Yeah. So is this? Do you think this is a direct effect that poorly educated women cook differently, or is it an indirect effect that this is a proxy for the level of dynamism when it comes to changing habits, or do you have an idea of mechanism?
I don't. I think we are investigating this, and this is why we want to do. We want to use the last part of our funds to study, to do a survey in various countries. Certainly, there is the fact that educated women work. Henceforth, they are not the only owner of the decision of who's cooking what. So this could be one of the, this is certainly one of the mechanisms, but on the other hand, if you give more power to women because they have studied and they own their part of income, maybe they have more decision on what to buy. So maybe they're not the ones who cook, but they can decide what we're gonna eat for dinner. So it's a mix of factors, and we really need to investigate this much more than just simply looking at numbers.
So in these presentations, we've looked at several levels. We've looked at the macro factors, the social macro factors. We've looked at the mid-level of city decision makers and city policy making, and companies and industries, and down to the individual consumer, both when it comes to actual food behavior and perceptions about food and eating. So many levels at play at the same time? Is this a super wicked problem where that needs to be addressed at a million levels at the same time, or is eating and food production actually accessible to account? Is it possible to reform it, or is it too complex to achieve? What do you think? Wicked problems have many factors.
One of us, or
yeah, anyone, yes.
I mean, like the way how you described it just now, I think it sounds very complex, right? And I think there are kind of a lot of interlinkages with regards to food and climate change. I think Hannes actually, and Valentina, you as well, you both laid out a lot of these complexities, right? The different drivers, and how, for example, biodiversity laws might be linked to kind of changes in agriculture and food system. But at the same time, I think there is also like an element of construction in this, like how do we depict climate change? And so that is something I think to keep in mind, because different actors, depending on where they're coming from, will depict it and describe it in a different way. To some, it's a huge, I mean, from a science perspective, it is a huge issue, but different actors, like depending on what their interests are, might describe it in another way. So I think that is something to kind of keep in mind there. And then probably also the aspect that, I mean, we talked a lot about diets, but the production and consumption are interrelated and influencing each other. So it's not just one side that is like has to wait for the other side to change, or vice versa, but they're interrelated. So these are, I think, two kind of points that come to my mind, at least.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for your presentations. I'd like to ask you finally, what is your best takeaway from the presentations you listened to today? What do our visitors, why don't you write in the chat what you took away? And how about our three presenters? We'd like to share something you picked up today. Who would like to start? Valentina?
I'd love to start. Yes, I think I think it's fascinating that people with very different backgrounds are finally getting at this topic. I think to your question before, although it's wicked, we wouldn't take this as a research topic if we didn't think, or at least hope, we could create some change. And it's not the arrival of a meteorite, it's our own, it's what we eat. And there are two dimensions that are fully aligned, which is our own health aligned with the planet health. So there's many things that I think are pushing in the right direction. So I'm very optimistic. I think that it's a deeply personal research topic. So whenever I teach about this, at the end of the course on climate change economics, I typically have 4 or 5 students who've decided to become vegetarian. So I think there is a potential for a change, especially as was said before, and as pointed out from some of the participants in younger generations. So the demographics matter. So I think people who are, listening to this might change more than we actually speaking at this event might change. I'm not talking about you, Fritzi. You belong to the younger generation.
Very much. Hannes, do you have something to share?
Yeah, I basically agree very much with what Valentina just said. I think it's really important that more of the research that's ongoing is being increasingly visible and being discussed. It's a topic where everybody has an opinion. And it's a complex topic, as you mentioned already. But there are still some simple things we can do. For example, not really supporting the things that destroy the climate or our health. And that starts, for example, with agricultural policies, and the support you get there. At the European level, you invest about 50% of the agriculture budget to promote animal keeping. Yeah? So why would I basically do this if I know that I have massive greenhouse gas
emissions associated with that, and if I really deteriorate the health of the population. Yeah? That is, at least from my point of view, not so easy to explain. Yeah? And I think that's also a discussion we should have. This is not against farmers, and that is very important to note. In this respect, we have to find other ways to support them. Maybe not with the subsidy system we have in place at the moment.
Thank you very much. Fritzi, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I think these were both really great points. I think the role of policy and kind of, as Hannah said, subsidies that are directed in a certain way and like thinking about how to redirect them is a very crucial element. I also really like the point about land and kind of that idea of the carbon opportunity cost that was raised earlier. So what happens if we change land use? And finally, also the role of city areas as some sort of catalyzer. So Valentina pointed out urbanization, and then Hannes is working directly with that. And there's just so much that can happen also on the level of cities. So that's really been a key takeaway for me. Yeah.
That's very true. And with that, it's time to wrap up. There will be more open lectures like this. So check out CIVICA's webpage for upcoming events. I would like to thank our three presenters for their fascinating presentations, and to you watching, I would like to say thank you for joining and welcome back.